This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, the thought, and the debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in social discourse in Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin. Our guest today is Professor Dov Waxman, a professor of political science, international affairs, and Israel studies at Northeastern University. Dov's most recent book and the star of an earlier podcast on the Tel Aviv Review was Trouble in the Tribe, the American-Jewish Conflict over Israel, published by Princeton University Press. So we're not actually going to be focusing just on the book because there is a whole podcast dedicated to it. And instead, we're going to talk about other topical issues that are sort of emerging from the themes of your book. And, of course, we have Gilad Halpern.
Yes. Hi. Thank you very much, Dahlia. Hello, Dov, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review again for the third time.
Thank you. It's good to be back on the show.
Okay. So when we discussed your book a bit more than 6 months ago, it was really before anyone except Ann Coulter, perhaps, could seriously envision a Donald Trump presidency. Now it's our new reality for the next 4 years. Or
maybe
not.
8 years.
Maybe 8 years. Who knows? Or less. Taking your book, do you think there's anything in it that you think now needs revision, given the new circumstances?
No, I don't think anything really needs revision. I think, if anything, the essential argument of the book has only been reinforced by what's happened since. In the book, I argued that there was a growing divide within the American Jewish community, a divide that was largely over Israel, but that was in fact indicative of a wider split between the non-Orthodox and Orthodox segments of the American Jewish community. And I think that split, that polarization between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews has only been reinforced by the election of Trump, and I think will grow even wider in the years ahead. I think the only difference, in ways from what I argued in the book, is that it's no longer just trouble in the tribe. It's no longer just an argument that's taking place within the American Jewish community, but we're now seeing this in a much wider sense across the United States, this polarization, these hardening of battle lines.
Mm-hmm. Is it really because of Trump's style or policies, or is it specifically about his attitude towards Israel and Israeli policies?
Well, I think the attitude toward Israel is one of the primary factors, but I think it goes beyond that. And I think the argument about Israel in general among American Jews is actually a reflection of a much deeper divide about American Jewish identity and about American Jewish values. In a way, I would characterize it as a divide between Jewish universalists and Jewish tribalists. What is it to be a Jew in the modern world? What are Jewish values? And so on the one hand, you have the view that asks, is Trump good for the Jews? And is Trump good for Israel in a narrow sense? And is the Trump administration likely to have a positive relationship with the Netanyahu government? And on the other hand, you have those who argue, that's far too narrow a question, and that looks at just Jewish interests in a very narrow parochial sense. And in fact, Jewishness and Jewish values are not only about the rights and needs of Jews, but also about protecting the rights and needs of other people, and that the history of the Jewish people means that we have to be concerned about discrimination, not just against Jews, but against all others.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a sign that I saw yesterday at one of the demonstrations. I think it was running around on social media, of a sign, I guess, of Jewish activists saying, to be Jewish means to be against racism, and to be Jewish means to be against occupation, and sort of conflating those things, the classic sort of intersectionality of the issues, but defining that Judaism for them means being against racism in general, but also against what they consider a form of racist policy among Jews.
Right, and I think in many ways this is also a battle over historical memory. I think much of the opposition to Trump within the American Jewish community is also based upon a historical memory of victimhood and of persecution, and the fears that Trump and the American First slogan that he's employed has evoked. And so on the one hand, you have that representation of Jewishness and notion of historical memory played out. And on the other hand, you have those who argue, narrowly, expressed himself to be pro-Israel. He has a Orthodox, Jewish son-in-law.
And if he can't make peace in the Middle East, who can?
Right. And so I think it's really very much about two competing notions of Jewishness and of Jewish identity.
But in that sense, it's not much difference from what it was under Obama, isn't it? So what is it really about Trump that makes it all more palpable or apparent? Is it really his style?
I mean, I would say it goes beyond Trump. I think that it's a mistake to focus on Trump personally. I mean, obviously he would like that because
seems to be his favorite game.
Yeah, but I think in fact the concerns that many people have go beyond what we might call them Trumpism, if you like. But it's really about the various social and political forces that have been unleashed in Trump's campaign, in his rise, and that are now feeling emboldened. So I think, to focus on where Trump, his personal views is less the issue, and it's more about the various social forces and his willingness to play upon those social forces and to turn a blind eye to some of the, nativist, racist, misogynist attitudes that have always been there. But what he's done is kind of, play upon them and encourage
legitimize
them.
them.
And legitimize them to some extent.
I want to take this in a slightly different direction because I feel like we've been talking an awful lot about Trump in this podcast already. Let's go back a few weeks before this inauguration when the outgoing administration made a couple of very significant moves with relation to American policy that seemed destined to put American policy towards Israel and Palestinians on a different track from where they apparently think Trump is going to go. So I'm talking, of course, about America abstaining from the UN Security Council resolution condemning settlements or Secretary Kerry's laying out of parameters on a two-state solution. What do you think is going to be the impact of that outgoing, those sort of tough, clear outgoing steps or steps of the outgoing administration relative to where Trump may take Israel-Palestine policy?
Well, I see those steps as belated attempts to preserve what remains of the possibility of a two-state solution. I mean, everybody, I think, recognizes, or at least is very concerned, that the Trump administration is going to give a green light to the annexationist bloc within the Israeli government, and the statements by some of those around Trump have suggested a willingness to, legitimize continued settlement expansion and consider alternatives to the two-state solution. So I think what President Obama in his last days in office was trying to do was kind of preserve and make sure that the consensus that about a two-state solution and that settlement building is legal remains intact despite President Trump's likely efforts to overturn that. I don't think, however, it's going to have any real bearing upon U.S. policy going forward.
So don't you think that those measures were perhaps too little, too late? I mean, doesn't it put the whole 8-year presidency of Obama and his failure to make headway in the Israeli-Palestinian process under a different light? I
think too little, too late could probably be the summation of every president's attempt to broker peace in the Middle East. I mean, we should remember that President George W. Bush only got involved in the Annapolis process in the waning days of his administration. President Clinton with Camp David and the Clinton parameters in the waning days of his administration. That sadly tells us a lot about American politics and the willingness of American presidents to engage in bold diplomacy in the Israeli-Palestinian context when they no longer have to run for office.
Well, except for the Oslo Accords brokered by President Clinton in 1993.
Well, but Clinton didn't have much of an involvement in that. That was more of a gift to the Americans, if you like.
Well, we should give credit to Jimmy Carter then for the Israeli-Egyptian. But that goes 40 years back.
And also is the reason why many presidents subsequently haven't wanted to follow his example.
Right, because he paid for it.
Because he paid a political price for it.
I'm wondering if look, yesterday we saw a gigantic backlash against Trump's inauguration with, over, I think I heard 1.5 million people on the street. Do you think that the Trump administration's position on the Israeli-Palestinian issue will cause a backlash among progressive American Jews who think, hey, he's going too far. He's going to destroy the two-state solution. We're going to be more active now. Or maybe there'll be a backlash in favor or, sort of a wave of support for what we consider will probably be more hardline approaches of the Trump administration. I'm talking specifically among American Jews.
My sense is that among American Jews, the focus is more likely to shift domestically within the United States now. I think there was, during the Obama presidency, a feeling that American Jews, because they felt secure at home, because liberalism domestically was reasonably secure, they could expend their liberal energies outwards and they could focus on trying to push Israel in a liberal direction. Now, American Jews themselves feel much more insecure than they did just a few months ago. Liberalism and progressive values in the United States fell under attack. So if anything, I expect there's likely to be a redirection of American Jewish energies, of liberal American Jewish energies, away from a focus on the struggle in Israel and more towards the domestic struggle in the United States.
How do you think it will play out in practice?
Well, I think we're already seeing a surge of support for the so-called Jewish social justice movement, for groups like Bend the Arc, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, all of these groups which have basically ignored Israel-Palestine for a long time and have focused on the social justice agenda domestically. I think they've already seen a huge surge in fundraising and the willingness of Jews to kind of sign up to fight those battles at home. And I think partly because there is so much despair and pessimism about the prospects for a two-state solution here, and general feeling that, there's very little that American Jews can do, that's going to possibly be a real challenge for groups like J Street and other groups that have really asked American Jews to focus their energies on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And if those things happen, doesn't that kind of leave the field clearer for Israel to advance in more annexationist, expansionist kind of policies here without any particular pressure or even a word of criticism really from American Jews who are busy with domestic Americans?
Absolutely. I think the combination of an administration that's going to be supportive of a right-wing Israeli government and American Jews who are going to be increasingly preoccupied with domestic concerns is going to help and embolden those on the right here. I think ultimately what should happen, on the other hand, is that there needs to be a realization that this is really a common struggle. This is a transnational struggle. This isn't just domestically in the United States. The same issues, the same forces that are at work here are also at work in the United States. And ultimately what needs to happen is coalitions need to be formed around the world, whether it be in Europe, in Israel, or in the United States, because it's ultimately a common struggle. But I'm not sure if
But
that's
it's very
gonna
interesting
happen.
because the American Jewish community has just over the last decade or so gotten around to making the connection and saying we can't just be liberals at home in America. That means we have to be liberals and protect the value of sort of universalist values and equality in Israel as well. And it was almost like that's just starting to take off in the U.S. And now you're saying this is going to kind of redirect their focus to domestic issues again.
I'd like to add to that and ask you, do you think that the liberal Americans, when their focus returns to be on Israel-Palestine, and that's bound to happen at some point, do you think that they're going to be radicalized in the same way that the Israeli liberal left was perhaps in the 1990s and the 2000s, and so that their paradigm would go beyond the two-state solution? Will they be, more radical in this sense?
I'm not sure I use the term radicalized, but I do think you'll see a strengthening of the left and the right, the Jewish left and the Jewish right, and a weakening of the center.
And the center cannot hold.
The center cannot. The center is weakening, and it's being pulled. And we're generally living across the Western world in a time of political polarization. And so I think if the strengthening of the Jewish left leads to a questioning of the two-state solution, then I think the focus is likely to be much more about rights, whatever kind of political framework. And I think also there's just simple exhaustion with it. I mean, having made the two-state solution the centerpiece of their campaigning with regards to Israel, I think people have really increasingly kind of grown tired of that, of the futility of that, and there's a kind of staleness to the debate around that. So to some extent, I think the focus will shift.
Do you think it's already happening? Do you see leading Jewish liberal intellectuals, sliding gradually to the left?
Well, I think there's certainly a growing debate now about alternative approaches to resolving the conflict.
This might be the time for proper disclosure that Dov and I have written an article together about other models for approaching conflict resolution in the Middle East. Namely, we examine the confederation idea.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of interest in these alternatives. So on the one hand, there's a greater willingness to think about other ways of resolving the conflict. But I think among American Jews on the left, there's also, and we've seen this in the support for the New Israel Fund, a focus away from the Israeli-Palestinian issue and really a belief that, we may not be able to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The two-state solution may be beyond our grasp. Now we have to safeguard democracy in Israel. And so the focus has become much more about trying to protect the rights of minorities and to safeguard democracy in Israel. And as I said, also the possibility of protecting democracy in the United States, which also can no longer be taken
this
for
raises
granted.
a fascinating question of whether you think Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, who has already presided over governments that have advanced rather less than democratic agenda items, including legislation, do you think that he and Trump will sort of take inspiration from each other and maybe legitimize a less democratic form of governance?
I think it's legitimizing and moving toward a form of illiberal democracy. I mean, democracy as the framework for majority decision-making remains the normative and accepted model around the world. But I think what's really under threat is a particular form of democracy, which we've come to associate in the West as the only form of democracy, namely liberal democracy. What's under attack in many places around the world is liberal democracy, is the values of liberalism and particularly minority rights within that framework. This notion that it's a kind of majoritarian democracy and that the government represents the name of the majority, which is the majority nation. And I think whether it's in Israel, whether it's in the United States, in Britain, in Russia, many other countries around the world, we're seeing the erosion of liberal democracy.
Mm-hmm. So actually, de Tocqueville is turning in his grave, and you are going to write your next book about illiberal democracies.
I think somebody might be working on that already.
Democracy in America.
Illiberal democracy,
exactly.
Yeah. So what do you think is going to be? You did say that the reaction of the American Jewish establishment, perhaps, or the population at large, to that is going to be a lot more forceful than it used to be. I mean, can you really distinguish between the grassroots movements within the Jewish community and the establishment?
So I think the grassroots were certainly seeing a surge of opposition to President Trump, and you're going to see continued mobilization on the grassroots level against the Trump administration. What's going to be really interesting to observe is what's going to happen within the so-called American Jewish establishment, the mainstream major organizations within the American Jewish community. Some have quickly taken opposition to Trump, like the ADL, and others, like the American Jewish Committee and AIPAC, have remained silent so far. And I think there's going to be a splintering to some extent. There's a lot of pressures on these groups from different forces as to which side they're going to take. And one of the real challenges for establishment organizations is going to be if, and I think it's likely, Trump doesn't launch kind of a campaign of anti-Semitism, and his administration is pro-Israel, what are they going to do? Are they going to listen to the views of the American Jewish majority who are stridently opposed to the Trump administration? Or are they going to say, well, as long as the Trump administration isn't coming after the Jews, and as long as they're supportive of the Israeli government, we will play ball and we want to maintain access with the Trump administration. If they take that approach, which I think is quite likely, then I think the divide or the gap, if you like, between the grassroots of the American Jewish community and the leadership of the American Jewish establishment, a gap that's already
I was going to say, in some
grow.
ways, this is really a gap that exists today.
Yeah. What we're going to see is really an intensification. I mean, this is something I wrote about in my book, was this gap between the grassroots of the American Jewish community and the American Jewish establishment. That divide is only likely to grow in the years ahead.
And again, Israel plays a big role in it, because if the establishment sidles up to the administration because of its Israel policy, then Israel plays, again, a very dividing role in the whole discourse.
Absolutely. One of the factors will be because of the Trump administration's policy toward Israel. But the other one, as I said, will also be its attitude toward the Jews. If American Jews themselves don't feel Israel under attack. And instead it's, as is probably more likely, Muslims, Latinos, people of color, under attack, women. Then the question is, well, do you stand on behalf of the values of most American Jews, the liberal values, and speak out against the discrimination or the prejudice that others are facing? Or do you take the view that, well, as long as they're not coming after the Jews, we're not going to protest?
Well, I mean, considering how some of those organizations have dealt very narrowly on the Israel policy issue for the American government, certainly at the expense of human rights inside Israel. Of course, Palestinian human rights are not top of their agenda by any stretch. It's hard to imagine why they would suddenly decide to expand their agenda to American, human or civil rights for other communities. I mean, they are narrowly focused and narrowly defined on supporting the Israeli government perspective. Certainly AIPAC, that's basically their mission is to support the Israeli government perspective. That's
true, but I think we should also bear in mind the fact that the majority of their supporters and still the majority of their donors are Democrats. This is an administration that is deeply unpopular. And so there's going to be a lot of internal pressure. On the one hand, they might recognize that it makes good politics to play nice with this administration and it's good for their organizational interests. On the other hand, I think they're going to be coming internally under pressure from people who say we need to stand up and be counted at this moment.
Do you think that they're in danger of being defunded by some of these Democratic-leaning Americans who are big supporters of AIPAC?
AIPAC, I think, has other sets of issues. AIPAC is going to be challenged not so much on the funding level because AIPAC remains financially, a powerhouse.
And a powerhouse probably supported by mostly Republican-leaning Jews anyway.
I think some of their biggest donors, but probably majority of their small, the national membership of AIPAC, the dues-paying members are mostly Democrats. But I think their challenge is going to be what we've already also seen beginning under the Obama administration, which is the erosion of the bipartisan consensus around Israel in Congress. AIPAC are going to be caught between a much more right-wing Trump administration and a much more right-wing Congress who are going to be wanting to do or suggesting things like moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, and their kind of instinct, which is to try to retain support for Israel among Democrats and maintain Israel as a bipartisan issue.
Well, what do you have to say, indeed, about the moving the American embassy to Jerusalem? To what extent does it really play a role in the whole discourse? Here in Israel, it's seen as, the most favorable gesture an American administration could do to Israel. Is it really the way it's perceived also among American Jews?
It's being framed as a symbol of a pro-Israel administration. So, the danger is that it's taken on this symbolic character now, that although previous presidents, when they were campaigning, have also talked about moving the embassy, the importance that this issue is now attained, and it's now being framed as a kind of litmus test of whether this administration is going to follow through and really differentiate itself from the Obama administration. That's what concerns me, that I think they might actually make this move, which I actually personally don't even think the Israeli government want. And
I can tell you the Israeli public, certainly it's being portrayed the way Gilad said, but it's certainly not going to affect the life of a single Israeli, other than those many people who will flock to Tel Aviv to come get visas if the consular section moves, and they probably won't be one bit too happy about it.
Right, and it may in fact affect the lives of Israelis if it leads to an upsurge and violence.
Sure.
So I think this is a symbolic issue, but as a symbolic issue, it has become important now.
It's because it's a symbolic issue.
And what about the likely appointment of David Friedman, a big supporter of the settlement in the West Bank, as Trump's likely ambassador to Israel,
and a big enemy of the liberal Jewish left in America. Famously having called them capos.
Yeah, I think this is as important. This is whether President Trump realized it or not, this is a major shot in the internal Jewish culture war, if you like, that's been ongoing. The appointment of Friedman, somebody who's described supporters of J Street as worse than capos.
Yes. And explained why they were worse than capos.
And has stood by that, is so offensive to most American Jews.
I would think it would be offensive to most human beings, actually.
It should be most offensive. I think one of the things we're realizing is that what one person finds deeply offensive today is seen as completely acceptable by somebody else. So we can no longer take for granted anybody's sense sense of propriety any longer.
Civility,
yeah. But I think if Friedman does get the appointment, then he's not going to be in a position of making the policy. It's a symbol, and to me it's an indicative of how Trump regards the issue of Israel-Palestine, which is, if you put some Jew, preferably an Orthodox Jew, then they by themselves, whether they have no experience in the matter or not, they will be enough to appease or satisfy American Jews. That's deeply offensive, bordering on anti-Semitic, that it's enough to have a Jew, preferably one who wears a kippah, and that will be enough to, show that you care about Israel.
And who counts Trump's money.
Right.
While at it. All right, Dov Waxman, the author of Trouble in the Tribe, The American Jewish Conflict Over Israel, and a professor of political science, international affairs, and Israel studies at Northeastern University in the newly Christian Trumpland. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Pleasure to be here.
And also a big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are so many more from It Came From. You should listen to them all. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.